Every podcast episode has a conversation happening inside of it, which you might be thinking, of course there is, but it's not the conversation anyone is having out loud. It's the one happening inside of your listener's head. This is going to be while you're teaching, while you're telling stories, while you're explaining whatever it is that you're talking about in that episode. Your listener is quietly asking themselves a bunch of questions, such as, is what she's talking about, does it apply to me? Does she even really understand my problem? Can she help me with my situation? They are internalizing everything you are saying and pulling it back to themselves, which is very understandable because we all do that, into how can you help them? That's what they're looking for. And I know I have personally had many of these conversations all the time listening to podcasts, especially the one that's saying like, well, how would this even apply to me? Like, what do they offer? How does that apply to me? And whether you realize it or not, your episode structure, the way you come up with your podcast episodes, is either moving that conversation forward to giving them those answers, or it is stopping it completely. And that's what I want to talk about today. So, hey friend, welcome to Podcast First Marketing. I am Allison. If you're new here, thank you so much for joining me. I help business owners turn their podcast into a marketing system that supports their sales, bringing in clients, leads, email subscribers, without having to constantly be everywhere. In last week's episode, if you haven't listened to that yet, that's okay. But we did talk about why podcast listeners tend to make decisions a little bit differently than social media followers. And you can even put yourself in that situation and think about what you feel listening to a podcast versus what you feel watching someone's social media. But today I want to go even deeper because inside every podcast episode, there is that invisible sales conversation happening. And once you start noticing it, you will not look at your podcast episodes the same way again because we want to be thinking about thinking and how can I answer their questions? Will we answer every single question in every single episode? No. But at least if we have idea behind it, it does. When someone presses play on your podcast, they're not just listening. Well, they might be just listening, but chances are they're evaluating. They're thinking whether or not what you are saying is like their situation, or do you really even understand their specific problem? Would it work for them? Every time you explain something clearly, or you describe a problem that they recognize in themselves, they feel understood. You are building trust. And we all know that when trust is built, the likelihood of them becoming a client will increase. But if your episode stays purely informational, you're just giving tips and facts and quote unquote helpful information, something important never happens. They learn all sorts of things from you, but they don't move closer to a decision to work with you. And that is what we need. There is this natural progression that happens when a podcast listener will go through. First, they will discover you. They find your podcast and they start listening, maybe even binging several different episodes. And then they start to trust you. And that's what we want. And eventually they decide whether they want to work with you. The podcast is where that middle stage happens, the trust. And trust builds when listeners hear how you think, how you explain things, how you approach problems that they want solved, how you work with clients, all of these different things, they are listening to you, and that is building their trust. But what I will tell you is that trust alone does not create clients. Trust plus the direction you take them in. And this is where episode structure becomes so important. If someone listens to several episodes, but they never hear how you help people or what working with you even looks like, or what steps come next, like what do they need to do next, then that invisible conversation that they're having in their head, it stops. It never finishes. They might trust you. They're going to continue to come back and listen to you, know what to do with that trust. And that's where so many podcasts intentionally stall. I see this so many times. There is such great podcast out there, but if they had just done a few things a little bit differently, they would have seen the ROI and not stopped producing episodes. So my goal is to help you see those gaps. I want you to know leaks you have in your podcast, the leaks in the bucket, as I like to call them, so that you can bring in the ROI that you know you want your podcast to produce. So we need to have the structure in our episodes. And you may be thinking, well, how do I do that? I'm getting there. You need to make sure that each and every one of your episodes is what questions do your listeners have? If you go back and listen to episode 29, it's the episode about all of how to set up your podcast episodes so that you do get listeners to take action. That one goes into so much more detail about the actual structure of the episode. But what I want this episode to really, get the point across is that if you don't have that structure, they're not going to make that decision. Now, the reason I want you thinking about this invisible conversation is because it changes the way you approach your podcast episodes. Instead of simply teaching something helpful, you start thinking about the questions your listener is quietly asking while they listen. Things like, do I relate to this? Would this work for my situation? Is this something I should figure out on my own or get help with? When your episodes start answering those questions naturally, your podcast becomes a lot more powerful as a marketing tool for your business. You're answering those questions before they ever have to ask you. This is actually one of those things I work with my clients when we are planning their podcast strategy. And once you understand the conversations happening inside your listener's head, I know that sounds weird, but your episodes start working together in a completely different way. Next week, I want to talk to you about something that happens quite a lot to a lot of podcasters. Their episodes sound great, they're helpful, they're thoughtful, but they're still not bringing in clients. So there are a few very specific reasons why this happens. So I'm going to be talking about that next week. So make sure you come back for that one. And until then, keep creating episodes that move your listener one step closer to becoming your client. I will see you here next week.